In the stillness of night, when sleep feels distant and silence grows heavy, we turn to the echoes of history, not just facts, not just dates, but the quiet scars left on human hearts, stories of longing, of sorrow, of endurance that ripple across time. Tonight we walk into one such memory, the silent famine, Ireland's dark past under empire. A story not only of hunger, but of silence. The silence of fields left empty, of songs that fell quiet, of generations carrying wounds too deep to name. Here, in void histories, we do not rush. We linger. We listen. We invite you to rest with us, to drift slowly through forgotten chapters, to discover that history is not far away. It lives within us, whispering lessons for the present. So stay a while. Let the words move gently, like a lullaby of the past, and together let us remember what must never be forgotten. The silent famine, Ireland's dark past. Under empire, close your eyes and imagine, far away in time, a land wrapped in endless green. Rolling hills that rise and fall like gentle waves, fields that glisten with dew each morning, and rivers that move slowly as though they too are part of a great song. This was Ireland before the long shadow of empire began to stretch across it. In those early days, the land was not just soil and stone. It was alive, breathing through the laughter of children, the warmth of firelight, and the rhythm of songs carried from one generation to the next. The people lived close to the earth, close to the sea, and closer still to their stories. Legends whispered of ancient heroes, of spirits in the forests, of wisdom carried in every stone circle and every standing stone that dotted the countryside. There was hardship, as there always is in life. Storms swept across the coast. Winters sometimes grew long and hungry, but there was balance. The land gave, and the people honored what it gave. Farms were tended with care, and families gathered around hearths with gratitude for whatever the earth had offered. In the quiet villages, there was a sense of belonging so deep it almost felt eternal. Fiddles played in the evenings, songs rose in Gaelic, voices weaving together in tones that held both joy and sorrow. Language itself was music, shaping the way people dreamed and prayed. And in this weaving of words and melody, life was whole. But history often waits patiently, like a distant storm cloud. And as the people of Ireland tended their lives with humility and devotion, they could not see the storm that would one day break across their fields. Empires, far away, were restless. Ambitions stretched beyond borders, hungry for land, for wealth, for power. And in time, the gaze of empire turned toward Ireland. Yet here, in this first chapter, let us pause in the stillness of what once was. Imagine the silence of dawn before the rooster calls. Imagine the smoke rising gently from a cottage chimney, the smell of bread baked from the harvest, the voices of children chasing each other along stone paths. This was the Ireland that existed before conquest, whole, intact, full of memory and tradition. It is important to remember this picture because it is the foundation of all that follows. For only when we see what was whole can we understand what it means when that wholeness is broken. The land was not merely taken, it was disrupted. A culture, a rhythm, a way of life, slowed, fractured, and eventually silenced. So as you rest, let the image of that green Ireland stay in your mind, a place of rolling hills, of sacred myths, of voices rising in song, a place where life, though simple, carried meaning in every stone and every story. Because soon, the silence of dawn would be broken. Soon the first footsteps of empire would arrive, quiet at first, but with consequences that would echo across centuries. And so, we close this first moment of our story, not in despair, but in reverence. For before there was suffering, there was beauty. Before there was famine, there was abundance. And before there was silence, there was song. Let us carry this image with us as we step gently into the next part of Ireland's long and painful journey. The change did not come with a roar, it arrived quietly. Soft footsteps on ancient soil, a new voice in the halls of power, a presence that did not ask, but slowly began to take. At first, the people of Ireland did not see the danger. The empire's hand was gloved in promises, promises of protection, of order, of a shared future. British influence began with laws, with taxes, with the subtle redrawing of boundaries. And though life in the villages went on, something beneath the surface began to shift. The rhythm of the land no longer answered only to the people. Fields once passed down through generations were now claimed by landlords. Foreign names appeared on deeds, and those who had always walked freely on their own land found themselves tenants, paying rent for the right to stay where their ancestors had always lived. It was a slow erosion, not an open attack, but like water dripping on stone, it wore away the sense of belonging, the sense of safety, and soon, even the stories began to change. The old language, Gaelic, was discouraged. In schools, children were taught new words, new ways of thinking, new ways of being, and though some resisted, others found it easier to adapt, to bend, in order to survive. But deep inside, the people felt a growing unease. Something sacred was slipping away. Not all at once, but piece by piece. There were murmurs, quiet conversations by candlelight, whispers of resistance. But still, many hoped that things would not grow worse. They hoped for peace, for fairness, for balance. Yet history teaches us that empires seldom stop at halfway. The British presence grew stronger, more structured, more demanding. And the land was no longer Ireland's alone. The balance between ruler and ruled tilted further, and with each passing year, the space for freedom grew smaller. What had once been a partnership of survival between people and land became a hierarchy, with the empire at the top and the Irish beneath. In this quiet beginning, the seeds of conflict were sown, not through a single event, but through countless small changes, each one eroding the old ways, each one making the people feel a little less like themselves. This was the beginning of conflict, not loud, not violent, but heavy. Heavy with the weight of control, heavy with the silence of things taken without consent. And in that silence, something began to grow. A quiet resentment, a quiet determination, a quiet promise that the Irish spirit would not go quietly into history. It was not yet rebellion, but it was the beginning of questions, of doubt, of the quiet fire that would one day rise. As we close this chapter, let us sit for a moment in that silence, the silence of change not chosen, the silence of a people watching their land, their language, and their way of life slowly shift beneath their feet. And as we turn the page, we carry that silence with us, because soon it will give way to something louder, something deeper, the first stirrings of resistance, the first sparks of fire in the long night of empire. Conflict, once only a shadow, began to take shape. It started with voices hushed and uncertain at first, men gathering in secret, whispers in taverns, conversations by firelight, where eyes darted to the door, afraid someone might be listening. The Irish spirit tied to the land could not remain silent forever, for though the empire had claimed ownership, the people's hearts still belonged to the soil of their ancestors. And when the weight of injustice grew too heavy, voices became action. Action became defiance. Defiance became the first wars of resistance. These were not battles of equals, The empire carried wealth, weapons, and armies trained for conquest. The Irish carried something different, a desperate hope, a longing for dignity, and the memory of freedom that still lived in their stories. With pikes, with farm tools, with whatever they could find, they rose. Not because they believed they would easily win, but because they could not bear the silence of submission. The countryside became restless. Rebellion sparked like lightning in scattered places. One village would rise, then another. Some fought openly, others worked in secrecy, passing messages, hiding weapons, sheltering those pursued. It was not only a fight of swords, but a fight of survival. But the empire's hand was heavy, and its response was merciless. For every act of defiance, punishment followed swiftly. Homes burned, crops destroyed, leaders imprisoned or executed. And though the Irish fought with courage, each attempt seemed to end in suffering. Yet even in defeat, something remained unbroken. The Irish did not fight only for victory in the moment. They fought to remind themselves, and the empire, that their spirit still lived, that even if crushed, it would rise again, like wild grass growing back after fire. But war carries a cost, and it was the ordinary people who bore it most deeply. Families torn apart, fathers who never returned, mothers who carried grief like a second skin, children who grew up too quickly, learning that safety was a fragile thing, easily taken. The songs changed. What once had been songs of joy became laments. Ballads carried the memory of those who resisted, keeping alive names that might otherwise have been forgotten. Music became both wound and healing, reminding the people of their losses, but also of their unyielding courage. Each uprising left behind both scars and seeds. Scars, in the form of grief, despair, and the weight of defeat. Seeds, in the form of memory, pride, and the stubborn refusal to forget. And though the empire pressed harder, though it sought to silence the voice of rebellion, the very act of resistance ensured that silence could never be complete. Ireland's story in these years was not one of victory. It was a story of endurance, of people who chose to fight, even when the odds promised little but sorrow. Because to surrender without struggle would have meant the loss of something greater than life itself, the loss of identity, of dignity, of belonging. And so, the first wars came and went. The empire still stood, but so too did Ireland's spirit. Wounded, yes. Exhausted, yes. But not erased. As the fires of rebellion dimmed, the land seemed to fall back into uneasy quiet. But beneath that quiet, embers still glowed. The people knew that this was not the end. There would be more wars, more resistance, more attempts to break the chain of empire. For history had only begun to write its long and painful chapter. And as night turns again toward dawn, so too did Ireland's struggle wait for its next rising. This was not the end of conflict. It was only the beginning. The opening verses of a long lament that would stretch across generations. And as we leave this part of the story, we carry with us both the sorrow of defeat and the quiet fire of a people who refused to be silenced. The story of Ireland did not end with the first sparks of rebellion. If anything, those sparks only revealed how deeply the desire for freedom burned. And so, war did not vanish. It returned, again and again. Each generation, in its own way, reached for what had been taken. But the empire was vast. Its armies were disciplined. Its power stretched across oceans. And Ireland, though courageous, was small in comparison. Time after time, uprisings rose like waves, only to break against the stone of imperial might. The defeats were heavy, not only in numbers lost on the battlefield, but in the despair that followed. For every rising that failed, the people were left with questions. Was it worth the suffering? Was the price too great? Could hope survive when it seemed to lead only to sorrow? And yet, surrender never truly came. Even when weapons fell silent, the memory of resistance lingered. But the empire knew how to use exhaustion. It offered treaties, agreements that spoke the language of peace, but carried the weight of control. These were not fair bargains between equals. They were documents born of imbalance. Ireland, weakened by war, pressed by hunger, desperate for reprieve, and Britain, powerful, confident, unwilling to truly yield. What was signed on parchment felt less like peace and more like surrender written in ink. To the outside world, these agreements appeared as compromise. They looked like progress, like steps toward calm. But to those who lived under them, the truth was bitter. Land remained in foreign hands. Laws still favored the empire. Voices of the Irish were quieted, their choices limited, their future narrowed. It was a silence not of harmony, but of resignation, like a song forced to stop mid melody. The instrument still existed, the players still sat in place, but the music was stilled by command, not by choice. And yet, even in this silence, a quiet resistance survived. People remembered, in stories, in songs, in whispered prayers, they carried what treaties could not erase. Because a signature on paper cannot erase longing, it cannot erase grief, and it cannot erase the spirit of a people who know they were meant to live free. But the cost of these years was profound. Communities grew weary. Generations carried not just hunger, but a deep sense of loss. Loss of land, loss of culture, loss of trust. The countryside bore witness. Abandoned cottages stood as silent markers of those who had left or been driven away. Fields once alive with harvest stood empty, their owners gone. Every stone wall, every broken gate seemed a whisper of what had been taken. For the Irish, life became a series of compromises. To survive meant to endure. To endure meant to accept the weight of empire pressing down upon them. And so, while the fires of open rebellion dimmed, the inner fire of sorrow burned brighter. It was the quiet kind of pain, the kind that does not shout, but lingers in the heart, generation after generation. These painful agreements left Ireland not at peace, but suspended, caught between a longing for freedom and the heavy chains of submission. And though the empire believed it had secured control, what it truly secured was silence, a silence that would one day break in ways no treaty could prevent. For history moves slowly, but it does not forget, and even the heaviest defeats cannot erase memory. They cannot erase dignity. They cannot erase the yearning of a people bound but unbroken. And so, as this chapter closes, we are left in the uneasy quiet. The empire victorious on the surface, the Irish defeated but not erased, the parchment signed, but the heart still restless. This is the silence before the storm of famine, a silence born not of peace, but of wounds still open, waiting for the moment when history would cut even deeper. Hunger does not arrive as a sudden storm. It creeps slowly, almost silently, until it is everywhere. And when it finally takes hold, it changes not only the body, but the soul. For Ireland, the famine was not only a failure of crops, it was a failure of care. The potato, that humble root, had been the lifeline for countless families. When disease spread through the fields, the green leaves blackened, and the soil yielded only decay. Yet even as cottages emptied of food, ships still left Irish harbors, carrying grain away under the empire's orders. The land produced enough to feed its people, but its people were left to starve. The silence of this famine was deafening. Families sat in cottages with nothing to eat, their voices fading into whispers. Mothers held children whose cries grew weaker each night. Fathers searched the land, knowing there was little to be found. Roads became graveyards of footsteps, bodies too frail to carry on. The world outside moved forward, but in Ireland, time seemed to stop. What made this tragedy deeper was not only hunger itself, but the loneliness it carried. Communities once full of laughter now fell into quiet despair. Neighbors who once shared bread had nothing left to give. Songs that once rose at twilight turned into silence, as though even music had been taken away. And so, an entire generation bore scars they could not erase. Children grew up with memories of empty tables, with the sound of weeping mothers, with the sight of fathers growing thinner each passing day. These children, if they survived, carried those memories like shadows that followed them into adulthood. Some left. They boarded ships bound for America, for Canada, for Australia, seeking life elsewhere. For many, leaving was not a choice, but the only chance to survive. The ocean became a corridor of sorrow, carrying away the sons and daughters of Ireland, scattering them across the world. And so they built new lives. They carried with them the ache of exile, the ache of knowing they had left behind not only a homeland, but graves of those who could not leave. Those who stayed endured in silence. Entire villages vanished. Fields once full of life grew quiet. Stone cottages collapsed into ruins, reminders of families who had once filled them with warmth. Even today, those ruins stand in the Irish countryside, silent testimonies to the famine's reach. Generations were lost, not only to death, not only to migration, but to despair. Dreams that might have been lived were never lived. Children who might have grown into poets, leaders, healers, or singers were instead claimed by hunger. The future itself was thinned, like a flame reduced to embers. This was more than famine. It was erasure, not complete, because Ireland endured, but deep enough to leave wounds that never fully healed. And so, the scars became part of the nation's memory. Stories passed down not to frighten, but to remember. Songs sung not only to mourn, but to remind. The famine was no longer just an event of the past. It became part of Ireland's very soul, etched into the collective heart of its people. For the generations that followed, survival itself became an act of defiance. To live, to remember, to carry forward culture and language. This was resistance, because empire had hoped hunger would weaken Ireland forever. Instead, it left behind a legacy of resilience, carved out of sorrow. As we leave this chapter, let us pause in that silence, not only to hear the grief, but to hear the endurance within it. For though famine claimed lives and futures, it could not claim the spirit of Ireland completely. And so, even in loss, something remained, a memory, a voice, a whisper across generations saying, "We endured." This whisper carries us now into the final reflection, where we look back on all that is past and all that still remains. History does not end when the battles are over. It does not end when treaties are signed or when famine finally loosens its grip. History lingers. It lives in memory. It breathes in the silence of places once filled with voices. It whispers through generations, shaping who we are long after the moment has passed. For Ireland, the famine and the years of empire left scars too deep to fade. Scars etched not only on the land, but on the heart. Every ruined cottage, every abandoned field, every story passed down by a trembling voice. All of it remains as evidence. Evidence of pain, but also of endurance. And in reflecting on this story, we do not simply look back at sorrow. We look back at resilience. Because though empire sought to silence a people, it could not extinguish their spirit. Songs survived, stories endured. Language, once suppressed, found ways to live again. And even in exile, far across oceans, the children of Ireland carried with them the memory of home. There is something profoundly human in this. The way suffering becomes memory, the way memory becomes identity, and the way identity, even when battered, refuses to disappear. It is tempting to think of history as numbers. How many died? How many left? How many wars were lost? But history is not numbers. It is faces. It is voices. It is the small moments. The mother cradling her child, the father staring at an empty field, the child who dreams of a tomorrow that will never come. It is these moments that truly tell the story. And so, when we remember Ireland's famine, we remember not only hunger, but silence. The silence of a people denied care, the silence of a countryside emptied of laughter, the silence of graves unmarked, of futures unfulfilled. Yet silence is not the same as absence. Within that silence grew something unbreakable, a spirit of remembrance, a refusal to forget. And in that remembrance lies a lesson, not only for Ireland, but for us all. The lesson is simple, but heavy, that when power ignores suffering, it creates wounds that echo for centuries. That hunger is not only the absence of food, but the absence of compassion. That silence can be as cruel as violence when it comes from those who choose not to see. But there is another lesson too, that people can endure more than we imagine, that even in famine, even in exile, even in grief, the human heart finds ways to carry forward, ways to sing, ways to remember, ways to rebuild. And tonight, as we close this story, perhaps we can sit for a moment in that memory, not with despair, not with anger, but with quiet reverence, for the generations who suffered, for the generations who endured, and for the generations who still carry the whispers of that past within them. Ireland today is not the same Ireland of the famine years, yet its story is never far away. It lives in the land, in the ruins that still stand, in the music that drifts across pubs and gatherings, in the poems that speak of longing and sorrow. The famine is no longer happening, but it is never gone. And so, as we end, let us carry this thought that history is not only a record of what has been, it is a mirror, showing us what must never be repeated. It asks us to listen, to remember, to choose compassion where once silence reigned. Close your eyes now and let the memory of green fields return. Fields that once knew hunger, but now breathe with life. Imagine the hills of Ireland, quiet under the moonlight. Imagine the voices of those long gone, carried on the wind, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit endures. This is the story of Ireland's silent famine, a story of sorrow, a story of silence, but also a story of survival. And with that, we leave the past gently where it belongs, in memory, to be honored, to be remembered, to guide us softly into the night.